Over the past few weeks, we've had a lot of news surrounding President Biden's infrastructure plan, which aims to turbocharge the US shift from fossil fuels. The $2 trillion question, on paper, do you view it as feasible? And how do you expect it to tackle climate change?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the infrastructure plan is motivated by a number of different things. First, the need to create jobs in the near term. The U.S. has been and the world has been in a very tumultuous period with the economic crisis. And so there's a very clear focus on job creation. So that's one purpose. Another is to really invest in U.S. infrastructure, which has been underinvested in for several decades. Roads, bridges, the electric grid, the transportation system, really, buildings across the whole board. So that's a second motivation. And as you pointed out, a third major motivation is to really start in earnest the energy transition, to push toward net zero emissions over the next several decades in order to address the climate challenge. And so those are the high-level motivations for the plan. The plan, is feasible in the sense that a lot of the underpinnings of the plan are expenditure of public resources to make investments. And so in that sense, the feasibility is going to be measured by the ability to, first of all, pass that in legislation, and then to expend those resources in an effective way to make progress on the three fronts that I just mentioned. So in that sense, I think it's quite feasible. There's obviously political feasibility, which means working this through Congress, and then there's the implementation. There's many different elements to this plan, and so you'd have to drill down into each. Whether this is investments in the transmission grid, whether it's investments in electric vehicle purchases. Are these investments in industrial decarbonization through tax credits and other mechanisms that could support things like low carbon hydrogen? We can go down the next level of detail to understand the implementation feasibility of each of those pieces. Finally, I'll just say, the ultimate kind of question of feasibility is what actions need to be taken in order to, over the next couple decades, decarbonize the power grid, and then to decarbonize and drive the entire economy to net zero. In some sense, that's the kind of bigger, longer-term feasibility question. And what the infrastructure plan is, it is one element of that, a very important element of that, but only one element of that.
Fantastic, thanks for that. And I'll get back to the decarbonization point shortly. I've got a question lined up for that. But over here in the UAE, for example, only last week, I think, and also visited India as part of the road trip, we had US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, on his renewable energy world tour, if you will. I just want to focus on the US for my next question again. And what do you expect lies ahead for future US environmental and energy policy? So I know you've mentioned, obviously, the importance of feasibility and decarbonization, but what are you, envisioning is going to happen in the next, 5 years or so with regards to the environmental and energy policy in the US as a whole?
Yes, so, when I was speaking a moment ago about infrastructure, I think I hit on a couple of the elements. Really, I think where the focus of U.S. Environmental and energy policy over the next several years is going to be very focused on the climate challenge. It's going to be around, first of all, creating jobs, both in terms of the need to address the kind of near-term economic situation, but also to support employment and job creation in the context of an energy transition. So I'd say that that's one thing that's going to underpin U.S. energy and environmental policy over the next several years. Then there's two major goals that have been set out by the Biden administration. One is to clean up the power sector, to drive the power sector to 100% clean by 2035. That's the next 15 years. So that's one major goal that's been put forward. And the second major goal is to drive the U.S. economy to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, by mid-century. And that's the other major goal. So that obviously goes beyond the power sector into transport, industry, buildings, and so on. And so those at a high level, I think, are going to be the principal drivers of U.S. energy and environmental policy, job creation, decarbonize the power grid, and then decarbonize the entire economy. Over the next several years, will just be, some steps in that direction, but I expect to see significant momentum. We're already seeing that, proposals from the administration, but ultimately there's also going to need to be actions by Congress to underpin these goals in law.
And if I just build further on, what are some of the technological and policy innovations that are necessary to secure the clean energy transition in the United States? Could you expand on that?
Sure. Yeah. I think of the three major ingredients in climate policy being, markets, technology, and policy. They all need to be driving the same direction in order to deliver on, driving emissions down over time. On the technological front, I think of this in kind of a sector by sector basis. There's the power sector, there's industrial emissions, there's forestry, land use, and agriculture. There's buildings and there's transportation. So these are the main different sectors where greenhouse gas emissions come from, and also where there's opportunities for storing carbon, for sinks of carbon, both in natural and engineered sources. So on a technological front, if I think about the power sector, there's a need to reduce the costs of certain clean energy technologies, clean power technologies. I think critical ones are advanced nuclear and the application of carbon capture and storage to fossil energy like natural gas. There's a need for grid technologies, so building out the transmission grid and driving down the cost of energy storage so that we can compensate for particularly renewable energy, which may be intermittent at times. So we need to have greater storage capability, another very important technological thing we need in the power sector. And another one in the power sector is, how do we balance demand and supply in the power sector in real time? And this is where a smart grid, smart appliances, advanced technology, advanced information technology being applied to the power sector. So then I could go to industry. On the industry side, we need to electrify certain areas of industry where we can, but there's also going to be process-related emissions, for example, associated with steel and cement, where carbon capture and storage can be a critical aspect of that. Also, clean hydrogen, decarbonized hydrogen, another very critical element. In transportation sector, electrification of transport is going to be very important and is becoming quite feasible for personal transport. But there's going to be other areas like aviation, which are going to require sustainable aviation fuels, and possibly for emissions that can't be offset, things like direct air capture, where you remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So on the technological front, there's a lot of different opportunities and also a lot of different needs across the economy to decarbonize fully throughout the economy. On the policy side, there's a number of different policy instruments that can be applied to addressing the climate challenge. One of those is carbon pricing, where we put economy-wide price on carbon to provide an economic incentive to reduce carbon emissions. Another key policy, which is, I think, going to have continued salience, is what you think of as performance standards. And I think the innovation there is creating what you can call tradable performance standards. So these are metrics where, for example, in the fuel sector, you might have a low carbon fuel standard, but applying that in a way that is inclusive of a range of different technological opportunities for decarbonizing fuels, and also allows flexibility across firms. And so you give rise to a tradable credit market in low carbon fuel credits. And so I think the application of tradable performance standards is a second major area where there'll be continued innovation and policy. And I'll just point to one other, which are financial instruments. And so we've had, particularly in the United States, we use tax credits a lot as a financial instrument. There's other financial instruments that can be used. One is called a contract for differences, where you're kind of reducing the amount of public expenditure necessary. And another idea is reverse auctions, where you have a particular goal for an amount of kind of clean power you might want to provide, and you in effect take bids in order to meet that goal at the least possible cost. So I think there's also innovations in financial policy interests as well that we'll see over time.
So just looking at the oil and gas industry, I mean, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to decarbonizing industry. How would you suggest we start with approaching the oil and gas industry as a whole?
Yeah, there's a number of different options that are available for reducing the emissions from oil and gas. One is by substituting in certain cases for other clean energy sources, like, for example, electrifying things that can be productively electrified. In other cases, for oil and gas production that is occurring, methane leak abatement is a very important challenge. Methane, which is basically, if you think of releasing natural gas directly to the atmosphere, it's a very potent greenhouse gas. And I also think of it as relatively low-hanging fruit that we could reduce the impact on the climate quite quickly in the near term, simply by reducing the amount of methane that is, in most cases, kind of mistakenly leaked to the atmosphere. So that needs to be addressed. Energy efficiency improvements in oil and gas operations, kind of reducing the carbon footprint of oil and gas production, is another avenue for reducing emissions associated with oil and gas. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is another very important avenue. We're seeing a number of technologies being developed for natural gas-based power, which can then be coupled with capturing that carbon dioxide and then storing it underground, or in some cases using it for things like enhanced oil recovery, so utilization of CO2. And finally, I would say direct air capture is another important thing to be working on. So for unavoidable emissions associated with oil and gas, direct air capture is an opportunity for, even though those emissions might be released to the atmosphere, they can then be captured and again stored underground or utilized in some way. So there are a number of different opportunities. I listed a number of them. Hydrogen is another one, creation of hydrogen to substitute for gaseous fuels is another key opportunity for oil and gas.
So my final question to you is now based on avoidable emissions, as you mentioned, and you've alluded to it earlier. You've mentioned it also in one of your answers earlier. But just to point it to you, with your experience in carbon markets, what is needed for these markets to grow in the future? Can you share some of your experience, dealing with carbon markets?
Yeah, I mean, one of the major benefits of carbon markets is that they are, very scalable. In fact, the whole notion of a carbon market, whether it's created through a cap and trade type system or possibly implemented through a carbon tax, is that it's quite easy to do these policies in an entirely comprehensive fashion, capturing all of emissions, right? So they are the I would say, the ultimately scalable policy instrument. We've seen them applied in the European emission trading system, covering most sectors, but not all. We've seen them applied in California. We've seen them applied economy-wide. We've seen them applied in the regional greenhouse gas initiative in the Northeast in the United States in the power sector. China is, really implementing now some of the most comprehensive, and because of the size of the country, largest tradable carbon performance standards. So, carbon markets have been used at very large scale. And I think particularly, carbon prices in many markets have also continued to rise. I think there was a question at some point in time whether carbon markets could drive substantial emission reductions. And I think we are at a point where they are, in fact, driving substantial emission reductions. And really, I think the only limitation to the ability of carbon markets to play a major role in this is kind of the political willingness to adopt carbon markets on a very wide scale. The final thing I'll say is that what we have seen is that while I'm an economist, while many economists like myself have historically thought of carbon markets as kind of the single instrument by which one might address the climate challenge, that's not what society is choosing. And I think we need to recognize that we're tending to see carbon markets and carbon pricing sit alongside other policy instruments like the ones that I alluded to earlier, performance standards for certain sectors, financial incentives for technology deployment, investment in R&D. So what we're really seeing is a policy portfolio of which I continue to think, though, carbon pricing is an incredibly important element of that.